Why does whenever I pose a question on Stack Overflow and I talk about returning data objects and putting them on my webpage, does somebody pop up in the comments and say,
You need to be using a DTO.
why when I'm serializing data retrieved from a third-party service, does somebody say,
You need to convert that into a DTO first.
how come whenever I start pushing data from my webpage into the controller and onto a service, do people start bringing up stuff like hexagonal architecture and ports and adapters? What is hexagonal architecture? Do I really need this thing? Wait a second. Back up. Let's take this one step at a time. DTO stands for Data Transfer Object. They're the M in MVC, which stands for Model View Controller. So DTOs are a form of modeling. They're a way to represent data. That's why they're called data transfer objects. But they're different than entity objects. Entities are objects used to interact with the database. The term entity predates JPA. Maybe you're familiar with the @entity annotation if you've done any form of JPA-based programming, but you can actually go find tools that have been out there for years, like Irwin, ERWin, a tool for entity relationship management. This is years before JPA ever emerged. DTOs, or web model objects, are not entities. We have them for one key reason: single responsibility principle. We really like coming up with expressions for stuff, don't we? That's fancy talk for minimizing the amount of change that happens when one thing changes. You want a class that does one thing and does it well. So if there's any changes that have nothing to do with the class, it won't impact the class directly. If the database schema changes, the web layer shouldn't have to, unless it's a breaking change. If the web layer changes, the database entities shouldn't have to change. That's why when you're given a presentation, say to the CTO of a company or at a Java user group meeting, it's okay to take some shortcuts and take those entity objects you retrieved out of the database and just put them on the web page. You're kind of trying to demonstrate a big concept. In those scenarios, people often will just skip the DTOs altogether and just use entity types. But what's important to remember is that demos are not real applications. Real applications have some other key characteristics, including being in production, lasting a long time, having many changes to deal with, and evolving with requirements. If you give a presentation to a CTO, are you going to have any of that kind of stuff happen to you? No, you're not. Not unless you're explicitly demonstrating rolling something out to production, right? Demo apps don't have to do any of this, hence demo apps really don't need DTOs. But the second you shift your focus to building a real-world production application, you absolutely need to consider using DTOs.
This video is sponsored by Learning Spring Boot 3.0 3rd Edition. Do you want to build a Java app without wasting time? Do you need to create a web layer backed by a powerful yet intuitive data layer? And do you want to protect your users with the most up-to-date and widely used security tools? Learning Spring Boot 3.0 3rd Edition will show you the way. And to top things off, it even includes how to deploy and maintain your application in production. Check it out at springbootlearning.com/book and pre-order your copy today.
Production applications must constrain risk. They do need the DTOs. If you add a new column to a database table, does the web page need that update right away? Not necessarily. If you dropped a local service in favor of a remote one, does that need to impact the web page? No. With DTOs, the only time something is going to impact the web page is with deliberate action. Now, if you'll hang on to the end of the video, I will cover when you should be using DTOs, but first let's talk about when you don't need them. So the times when you don't need to use data transfer objects or DTOs is for those demo applications and for showing off a concept, like selling the concept of Spring Boot to the CTO of a company. The place where you do need to pick up those DTOs and use them properly is in a production application. Now, at the beginning of the video, we brought up some buzzwords like hexagonal architecture, ports and adapters. These are fancy architectural styles where you absolutely have different classes at the web layer versus what you could think of as an inner layer where your services are. The web layer is where the users come in from outside and interact with your application, whereas the database is internal. And so, in a sense, you need this translating layer between the web and between the services and the database. And typically, the reason they call it hexagonal, there's no reason why it has to be six-sided is simply because the shapes that they draw on diagrams happen to be hexagon. Another name for it is called ports and adapters. More lingo to help communicate the concept at hand, but fundamentally what we're talking about is a class that represents what's on the web page coming into a controller. The controller can transform it to some kind of internal type and hand it off to the service. This is the kind of stuff controllers are good for. They're meant to bridge the gap between our internal systems and our external systems. So this is where doing the translation in the controller is good, where you can convert from DTO to an entity type. And then after that, the internal stuff can work on that. It's also possible if you're going from web to service to repository, you could have a second layer of translation in there somewhere. The web layer could get translated to an internal repository unaware type and go into the service layer. The service can deal with this thing and have no need to understand what happens in the web. And from there, it can translate it into entity types. Whether or not you actually needed to do that is up for debate. It may be you don't need that amount of decoupling, that amount of risk reduction. But sometimes systems can grow so huge that maybe they actually do need that level. So again, that's another way to constrain risk. Let's have different classes at different layers to control that. And you know, it's okay to have extra classes. If it helps reduce risk, it's something to consider putting into your application. DTOs give us the ability to control how things are going to form. What I mean by that is if, say, you're using Jackson for doing JSON serialization and deserialization, DTOs let you put in all the annotations that will take the raw data and convert it into a representation that users will consume. And that way you have a very tight control over how that gets assembled. And the thing is all the work you do there will have no impact on what the repository layer needs to do with the entity types. Entity types need to have their own columns and fields and annotations in order to work with stuff, whether you're talking about JPA that actually has an added entity, or you're talking about something else like Redis or MongoDB, which, whereas they don't have an entity annotation, it's still the same fundamental concept where you're dealing with database entities. If you're building a full-blown web application where you're converting DTO objects to entity types in the controller layer, you're not done yet. So I want you to go watch this video where you will learn all the various tactics to dig through and find the data you're looking for using Spring Data.